Good evening to all the beautiful people tuning in. I'm here to help you sleep. Please support me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're watching from and at what time, so drop a comment below. Are you ready? Let's start with the first story.
The title of the story:
The Demon of Flesh and Blood. The village of Brockley had long been forgotten by the world. Tucked away in a shadowy corner of rural Europe, it lay hidden beneath the dense canopy of trees, half drowned by the rugged mountain range that rose like an ancient spine from the earth. Once a thriving community, its cobblestone streets were now cracked and overrun with ivy. The wind whispered through the hollowed remains of houses, carrying with it the stench of rot and decay. Time had been cruel to Brockley, but its abandonment was not without reason. For decades, villagers had disappeared without a trace, one by one, their faces lost to the darkness. The elders whispered of an ancient curse, of a malevolent entity that prowled the woods. A demon, born from the deepest pits of the earth, hungry for the flesh of the living. Known as the Flesh-Eater, this creature was no mere phantom, but a being of flesh and blood, insatiable and vile. It hunted not for food, but for organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver. As long as it fed on human organs, it could sustain its unholy existence. In desperation, the villagers had turned to a dark ritual to appease the demon. Each year, they offered one of their own as a sacrifice, someone strong, someone healthy. They hoped that the demon would be satisfied, that the village would be spared. But as more and more of the community disappeared, the ritual began to unravel. The sacrifices were no longer enough. The demon's hunger grew, and eventually the village was abandoned, the few survivors fleeing in terror, leaving behind only their haunted memories. That was how Brockley had remained, forgotten, decaying, and cursed. But legends have a way of finding their way into the hearts of the curious. Have you heard of Brockley? Anna's voice was barely a whisper as she leaned over the fire pit, her eyes gleaming with excitement. The group of teens sat around her, the crackling of the fire cutting through the otherwise eerie silence of the forest around them. Brett, always the skeptic, chuckled. "Yeah, I've heard the stories. Some demon lives there, right? Eats people's organs or something." He rolled his eyes. "Sounds like an urban legend to me." "You're right," Anna replied, her lips curling into a grin. "But what if it's not just a story? What if the village is still there, still haunted by the demon? What if we could—" "Let me guess," interrupted Kyle, another member of the group. "Go there, explore, and prove it's all fake?" "Exactly," Anna said, her voice low and insistent. "Think about it. We could get real footage, real proof, a place no one's ever gone to in years. It's perfect." The other teens exchanged uneasy glances. The idea of going to a long-abandoned village, even one as cursed as Brockley, had a certain allure, an irresistible temptation. Despite their fears, the pull of adventure won over the trepidation gnawing at their insides. After all, what was the harm in a little exploration? By the time they arrived at Brockley, the sun had begun to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ruined village. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and earth, and the silence was deafening. Their footsteps echoed eerily through the streets as they made their way past collapsed homes and cracked walls. Anna led the group with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "This place is—" Insane, she murmured. It's like time just stopped here. Brett pulled out his phone, attempting to capture footage, but his camera flickered sporadically. Must be some interference. This place is seriously messed up. The group ventured deeper into the village. The houses, once full of life, were now hollow shells. Rusted doors creaked as they swung on their hinges. The wind whispered through the broken windows, as if the village itself were trying to speak. Suddenly, Kyle froze. "Did you hear that?"
The others stopped, straining their ears. At first, there was nothing. But then, faint, almost imperceptible, the sound of footsteps, dragging, slow, coming from one of the nearby houses. The group's collective breath caught in their throats. Anna's flashlight flickered again, casting strange, dancing shadows on the decaying walls. "I don't like this," whispered Sarah, the quietest of the group. "We should leave." Anna shook her head. "We came here for a reason. Let's check it out." Against their better judgment, they followed Anna toward the source of the sound. As they approached the door of a crumbling house, the footsteps grew louder, closer. Anna pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the air. Inside, the air was cold, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. In the center of the room stood an altar, crude and covered in dark stains. The air grew heavier with each step they took, as though something were watching them, waiting. Brett shone his flashlight on the altar, revealing strange symbols etched into the stone, some of which appeared to have been recently disturbed. "What the hell is this?" Before anyone could respond, the room seemed to shift, the air growing thick with a foul stench. A deep growl reverberated through the walls, vibrating the floor beneath their feet. The shadows in the room lengthened, twisted, and suddenly something moved. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, gaunt creature with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. The demon. Panic surged through the group as they turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting crash. The demon's form shifted, growing larger, more solid, until it loomed in front of them. "It feeds on us," whispered Anna, her voice trembling. It needs us to survive." The others backed away in horror, but the demon was relentless. It moved with a terrible swiftness, a hunger in every movement. And then, in an unexpected twist, Anna stepped forward, her face blank, her eyes distant. I didn't want anyone to know. But it's too late now." Before they could react, Anna turned to face the demon, her hand raised in an almost ceremonial gesture. The demon stopped in its tracks, its eyes narrowing, as if recognizing her. "You've been feeding it all along," whispered Brett, his voice filled with disbelief. Anna smiled faintly. "Not just feeding. I am the sacrifice. Every year, someone from this group was chosen. I've been bringing them here years, just like the villagers did. Only this time, it's me." With a final, terrible scream, Anna collapsed, her body absorbed into the demon's grasp. The demon fed, devouring her flesh, leaving only a charred, lifeless husk behind. The group stood frozen, horror paralyzing them. In the end, Brockley would remain cursed, the demon continuing its insatiable hunt for flesh. But now, the village was not abandoned, not entirely. Anna had become part of the village's dark history, its newest soul to be claimed by the flesh-eater. And as the demon's hunger subsided, the village waited for its next visitors.
The title of the story: The Flesh-Eater's Curse. The Thorne family arrived in the village of Voles on a brisk autumn evening, as the last rays of the sun cast a blood-red hue over the fog-covered hills. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. They had left behind the busy life of the city in search of peace and solitude, and this farmhouse, tucked away on the edge of a remote village, seemed like the perfect place to start anew. The house itself was old, dating back to the 1700s, according to the realtor, but there was something enchanting about its weathered stone walls, ivy creeping up the sides, and a chimney that puffed out the occasional curl of smoke. For Oliver, the youngest of the Thorne children, the house was an endless playground, ripe for exploration. But none of them knew that the house stood atop an ancient burial ground, one forgotten by time, but not by the darkness that lay beneath. An evil that had slumbered for centuries had now been awakened. Oliver, ever the curious boy, had been wandering the woods behind the farmhouse one day when he discovered a crypt half buried in the overgrown underbrush. It was a decayed structure marked by strange symbols that seemed to writhe under his gaze. Without thinking, he ventured inside, his small hands brushing away centuries of dust from a stone slab that sat at the center of the chamber. A chilling wind rushed out as he disturbed the grave, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. It was in that moment that the curse was set free. At first, the Thorne family noticed only minor inconveniences. The doors creaked open by themselves late at night, and an unsettling draft ran through the house. The kitchen faucet would suddenly turn on when no one was near, and the eerie sounds of whispered voices seemed to fill the silence of their home. They dismissed it at first, simple oddities in an old house, nothing to be afraid of. But it didn't take long before the true horror began to reveal itself. The first victim was an old woman who lived alone in the village, just a short walk away from the Thorne family's farmhouse. Her body was found in the woods, her chest cavity hollowed out, as though something had gnawed at her organs. No one had seen anything strange, but there was a sense of unease in the village. People began to whisper of strange happenings at night, loud footsteps in the woods, shadows that moved in the corners of their eyes. The whispers grew louder when another villager disappeared, and then another. The Thorne family's peaceful life soon turned to one of constant dread. Every night, they could hear the sound of footsteps outside their door, slow, dragging steps, as though something was dragging itself across the ground. Sometimes they heard a low growl that reverberated through the walls. Other times, it was a faint whisper that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Feed me." One night, as a particularly violent storm raged outside, Sarah Thorne, the matriarch of the family, was woken by the sound of something scraping at the door. She lay there, frozen, unable to move as the noise continued. Long nails scraping against wood, an unrelenting rhythm that filled her with a sense of dread so overwhelming it felt as though her chest would collapse from the weight of it. Then there came the whisper, clearer this time,
close enough that she felt the breath on her skin. "I'm hungry." She could no longer deny it. Whatever had been awakened by Oliver's actions was hunting them.
The family began to unravel. Sleep-deprived and terrified, they no longer felt safe in their own home. One evening, as Sarah made her way through the village in search of answers, she stumbled upon an old historian who had lived in the area all his life. His name was Ludwig, and he seemed to know more than he should. As Sarah described the strange events, Ludwig's face grew pale. He handed her an old, tattered book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. "This curse, it's ancient," Ludwig said, his voice trembling. "The creature you've released is no ordinary demon. It feeds on human flesh, but more specifically, it craves the internal organs, the very life force of its victims. It was buried here centuries ago, bound by a powerful ritual. But now the curse has been broken." He flipped through the book, showing Sarah images of the demon, a grotesque creature with pale, sagging skin, its face twisted in an eternal grimace. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its long, bony fingers were tipped with claws sharp enough to tear through bone. "The demon can only be stopped by returning it to the grave, but it will not go back willingly. The one who frees it must make a sacrifice, an offering to bind it once more." Sarah's heart sank. A sacrifice? The thought gnawed at her. But who could make such a sacrifice? Who could willingly give up their life to end this nightmare? That night, the demon came closer. Sarah heard the scraping sound again, only this time it was accompanied by a wet, slurping noise. Her heart raced. She rushed to her children's rooms, only to find that they were not asleep. Oliver stood in the hallway, staring at the door with wide eyes. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can feel it." The house grew colder with every passing second. The whispers intensified, and then, just as it seemed as though the darkness would swallow them whole, Sarah realized what had to be done. The curse could not be undone unless someone willingly returned the demon to the grave. "I'll do it," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "I'll end it." The family gathered in the woods near the decayed crypt where Oliver had first set the demon free. The air was thick with tension as Sarah knelt before the stone slab, knowing what she must do. The ground around her shifted, and the whispers grew louder, now taunting her. She could feel the creature drawing near, its presence like a shadow pressing in from every angle. "I'm sorry, Oliver," she whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. "But I have to save you." Just as she raised her hands to the ground, the final twist of the curse revealed itself. The truth was more horrifying than anything Sarah had imagined. As the stone slab cracked open, the demon didn't emerge. Instead, a ghastly figure appeared before her. A man, his skin taut and yellowed, his hollow eyes locked on hers. It was Ludwig, the historian. "I was waiting for you," he croaked, his voice raspy and filled with malice. "You see, The curse was never meant to be broken. Your bloodline is bound to this demon. You are the one who must feed it." Before Sarah could comprehend what was happening, she felt herself being pulled toward the crypt. The whispers swirled around her as she struggled to escape, but it was no use. The demon had never needed to be bound. It had been waiting all along for Sarah's family to return. Her bloodline had always been its prey.
The title of the story:
The Silent Feaster. The wind howled through the empty streets of Roderick Hill, a forgotten town buried deep within the European countryside. The streets, lined with old stone houses, had once been the pride of the village, but now they felt like abandoned tombs, shrouded in an eerie silence. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, where life passed by at a slow, predictable pace, until the disappearances began. It started with a local baker, Herman. One morning, his wife arrived at his shop to find the door ajar, the oven cold, and the shelves untouched. His bed was undisturbed, the house untouched. There was no sign of a struggle. But Herman was gone. The police searched, questioned neighbors, but no one had seen or heard a thing. His disappearance was as silent as the wind itself. The only clue was a lingering, unsettling absence, the unmistakable absence of organs. There were no bloody trails, no mutilations, just the hollow emptiness where his heart and liver had once been. The town initially assumed it was some sort of accident, but then it happened again. And again. One by one, people vanished, their homes untouched, their lives erased without a trace. Each disappearance left behind a terrible emptiness, as if something or someone had feasted on them in the dead of night. Fear took hold of the community, but the worst part was that no one dared speak a word. No one wanted to draw attention to the truth they were all too terrified to admit. There was something in Roderick Hill that shouldn't be there. Elias Hartman was not unfamiliar with cases of the unexplained. He had seen strange things in his years of service, but nothing like this. He was called in when Clara, a young woman in her 20s, disappeared without a trace. Her parents were beside themselves, their faces pale with fear, their voices cracked with desperation. They knew something had taken their daughter, but they couldn't say what. Elias was determined to uncover the truth. Arriving in Roderick Hill, Elias felt the weight of the town's silent dread pressing on him. The air was thick with unease, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Elias was a seasoned investigator, methodical, precise, and patient. Yet as he walked through the town, speaking with neighbors and scouring the scene of Clara's disappearance, he felt an unnerving chill creeping up his spine. It was as though someone, or something, was watching him, observing his every move. The more Elias dug, the more things didn't add up. Clara's room had been pristine, her belongings untouched, her bed neatly made.
There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows or forced doors. Even the small scratches she might have made in the midst of a desperate escape were absent. It was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. He felt a creeping sense of dread settle deep in his gut. Something was very wrong in Roderick Hill. But what? As he spent long, sleepless nights piecing together the scant evidence, he began to notice strange things. His own sleep was plagued with odd, nightmarish dreams. Whispers filled the air whenever he was alone, faint but unmistakable voices that seemed to speak in a language he couldn't understand. At night, when he walked through the town, he would hear creaking footsteps behind him, the unmistakable sound of someone following in the dark. Yet when he turned, the street was always empty. Then there were the cold spots. They appeared in the most unlikely places, a chill that seeped into his bones, leaving him shivering despite the warmth of the night. The sensation was disorienting, almost as though the cold was not a natural occurrence, but something sentient, something aware of his presence.
One evening, while poring over ancient records at the town library, Elias stumbled upon a document buried beneath layers of dust. It was an old town legend, passed down through generations. The tale spoke of a creature, a demon, that had once lurked in the hills surrounding Roderick Hill. It was known as the Silent Feaster, a grotesque entity that fed on the organs of the living. According to the legend, it would sneak into homes under the cover of darkness, slipping in unnoticed as its victims slept, and remove their organs with surgical precision. The victims would wake in the morning, cold and lifeless, but without a single mark on their bodies. No blood, no wounds, just hollow shells. The townspeople had lived in terror of the Silent Feaster for centuries, but over time the legend faded into obscurity. No one spoke of it anymore. No one dared to. But now, as Elias read the old words, a cold realization gripped him. The disappearances, the unsettling feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, it wasn't a coincidence. The Silent Feaster was real. Elias knew that he had to confront whatever evil had taken root in Roderick Hill. His investigation led him to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a crumbling structure that locals whispered about but never visited. It was here, they said, that the creature had once been seen, a dark, twisted thing with eyes like hollow pits and hands that could strip a person's flesh in seconds. The stories were vague, fragmented, but Elias had to know if there was any truth to them. He entered the house alone, his flashlight flickering in the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with dust and decay, the floor creaking beneath his weight as he moved through the house. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional whispering sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up
as he ventured deeper into the building. Then, as he reached the basement, Elias heard it. A faint rustling sound, like something moving in the dark. His heart raced as he descended into the cold and damp depths. There, in the shadows, he saw it. A shape, a figure. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and its breath echoed like the sound of wind through a hollow tunnel. Elias froze. The figure moved closer, its face obscured by darkness, its movements slow and deliberate. And as it came into view, Elias's stomach churned. The creature was a grotesque parody of humanity, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, its hands long and clawed, dripped with some viscous fluid. And then, as it opened its mouth, Elias saw the truth. The silent feaster was not some ancient demon, but something much worse. It had been living in plain sight, feeding on the unsuspecting townsfolk for years. The creature had never left Roderick Hill. It had been there all along, hiding in the shadows, feeding on the organs of those it took, and never leaving a trace. And Elias had been searching for it, unknowingly walking right into its trap. But just as he thought he was lost, just as he braced for the inevitable, he realized the truth. The silent feaster was not hunting him. It was simply watching. It had been feeding on his very soul, not through violence, but through fear. And as Elias took his last breath, he understood. The creature had always been with him, feeding off his terror, leaving him hollow. The town had always known, but they had kept the secret. The silent feaster had already claimed its latest victim.